Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Thomas Egdorf. I'm the Director of the AIDS Bereavement and Resiliency Program of Ontario. We're just waiting for a few more people to sign in. I don't know about you, but I've had some issues with my internet this morning. So we'll get started in 2 minutes. Thank you. Well, I see it's 1 minute after 12. I'm going to suggest we get started because we only have an hour for this very important topic. So welcome everyone. Again, my name is Thomas Egdorf. I'm the Director of the AIDS Bereavement and Resiliency Program in Ontario. We were formed in 1994 as a response to the ongoing multiple loss experienced in the AIDS movement. And a few years ago, we expanded our mandate to also include harm reduction programs. So today we're coming together for a webinar called When Helpers Feel Helpless, Service in the Age of COVID-19. This webinar is in partnership between the Scarborough Centre for Healthy Communities and the AIDS Bereavement and Resiliency Program of Ontario. This webinar is being recorded, so even if your colleagues can't make it, it will be posted to our website in the coming days. We also have other pre-recorded webinars on our website. There's one for managers supporting teams over distance during COVID-19 and a very interesting 3-part series on resiliency. This webinar is geared towards frontline workers and volunteers in both the hospice and HIV/AIDS sector. The webinar will offer some context for why volunteers and workers may be feeling helpless, reframe of how to think about roles, and 3 concrete tips for learning to live into the new normal. Before we get started for the webinar, I'm going to bring on Craig Boucher, who works with ABRPO, to talk a little bit about how you'll be able to ask questions during this webinar. Craig, please take it.
Good afternoon, everyone. On the bottom of your screen, you're probably going to be able to see a chat icon that you can click on, and that will bring your direct questions to myself. Having gone through the webinar with Betty Ann previously, I will have some answers for Betty Ann, but I will say that there is a lot of content in this presentation. So depending on the questions, I may or may not interrupt Betty Ann as an agreement that we have amongst ourselves. However, we will try to address all questions at the very end of the webinar, or as many of them as we can. And those that we can't, we will certainly get out an email form to you.
Great, thank you, Craig. And now about our presenter. Betty Ann Rutledge is a passionate, professional, relationship-driven volunteer manager with 30 years of experience in the field of community-based healthcare, death, dying, and bereavement. Her work at the AIDS Committee of Toronto and Bereaved Families of Ontario Toronto office, as well as several community hospice programs, has included designing, developing, and delivering volunteer training programs based on the peer and mutual support model and centered in principles of equity and inclusion. She has journeyed with many people through illness, end of life, and bereavement, including both her parents and many friends. She is committed to creating safe and inclusive spaces for people to share their stories of loss, healing, resiliency, and meaning making. And that's her official bio. I will also say Betty Ann was the volunteer coordinator when I first started volunteering with the AIDS Committee of Toronto shortly after my HIV diagnosis in '93. And I have found her to always be a warm-hearted, caring, and loving person. I hope you all will enjoy this webinar. And now I'll give it to Betty Ann to take it over. Thank you.
Thank you for those lovely words, Thomas. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. I work at Scarborough Centre for Healthy Communities in the Community Hospice Program, and I've been a facilitator with ABRPO almost since the beginning. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to share space, even though it's virtual space, with folks who are on a mutual learning journey. I want to acknowledge also the founders of ABRPO, Yvette Perot and Wayne Fitton, as well as Christine Leonard, three people who've been incredibly valuable teachers and mentors to me over the years. And all of the clients and volunteers that I've had the privilege of working with, I really think that the people we work with are our best teachers. So this is a culmination of knowledge and wisdom I've gleaned from my interactions over the years. So for today, I really encourage you, if you're able, to just put your phone down, put your pens and papers away, and try not to worry about taking notes. As Thomas said, there will be a recording after and copies of the slides. So my invitation for you is to really just try and be present and experience our time together over the next little bit of time. And I want to start with a land acknowledgement, which is a formal statement that recognizes the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. As many of you know, it's an important part of the truth and reconciliation process because it reminds us of the cost paid by generations of Indigenous people in Canada so that we could gather here on our various traditional lands across Ontario on our journey together. This pandemic really makes so much more visible and accentuates all of the inequities in our world, including Canada's original peoples who've been stewards of our land for thousands of years. And so my hope on the other side of this is that we won't return to business as usual, but instead find ways to intentionally address these inequities in our communities. So as we gather today, I invite you to really try and let yourself be present. I always start off my sessions with volunteers by lighting a candle, which I have done already. So it's here. And for me, it's about helping to bring myself to the present moment and setting an intention for the time that we're going to be spending together. And so I invite you to just take a moment now to settle into wherever you're sitting and just to become still for a moment, becoming aware of the touch of your body on your seat, your feet on the floor or up on a chair, and just take a few deep breaths. You may want to gently lower your gaze or soften your eyes for a moment. Eyes that have likely been staring at screens a lot more than usual. And as you settle into this moment of quiet stillness, you can just notice if there's any worries, responsibilities, or distressing thoughts that might be fighting for your attention. Just take a moment to gently acknowledge them and then put them aside. It might help if you want to look around your workspace and find an object that could represent whatever is tugging at you, and maybe take it and put it out of your eyesight for the time that we're together. And just know that you can go back and pick it up after this is over. So Thomas talked about, what I'm offering today. And I want to say that I'm not an expert on living or working through a pandemic. I don't know about you. We've heard the term unprecedented a lot, and it really is an unprecedented time for all of us. A couple of months ago, my only cultural reference for Zooming was an old Aretha Franklin song. So this is really all new for me. And so what I'm offering you today are my own reflections in support of others who are also trying to live into this new normal. My hope is that you'll find a nugget or two of wisdom to support you in continuing to be your best selves in your role serving. So first, a little context. We're collectively experiencing a global disruption of norms, the likes of which most of us have never experienced. And in grief theory, it's called the shattering of the assumptive world. It's traumatic, it's disruptive, and much has been said over the last few weeks about the collective trauma response that we're all having, the fight, flight, or freeze phenomenon. And this constant living with uncertainty and change and stress, we're experiencing it in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts, our spirits, and it's really wreaking havoc on our systems. And we're all going to have our uniquely individual responses to this very shattering experience that we're all having. I think it's important to remember that we're all living through this pandemic with our own unique set of circumstances. I love this quote from Anais Nin, we don't see things as they are, we see them as we are, which I think is so true. And it's true for us, it's true for our colleagues, our families, our friends, and of course, it's true for the people that we serve. Some of us are deemed essential services, and so we have to be out in the world, putting ourselves at risk and our loved ones at risk. Some of us are privileged to be safely housed where it's possible to self-isolate and follow public health guidelines around physical distancing. Some are homeless or underhoused or otherwise living in unsafe conditions. And there's lots of other things that impact how we are experiencing this unprecedented time in our lives. So, if someone has experienced collective or historical trauma resulting from war, genocide, incarceration, poverty, terrorism, natural or human-made disasters, they're going to be experiencing this differently. And grief theory tells us that every loss we experience, and that's both death and non-death related losses, tends to resurrect the thoughts and feelings of previous losses. So not only will our past experiences inform, how we're experiencing what's happening now, but how we've coped in the past is also going to influence how we're meeting our current situation. So our current and changing social locations will impact how we experiencing what's happening now and experiencing as we live into this new normal. So it's really important to be aware that everyone we encounter has these unique set of lenses, and we are all seeing the world and experiencing the world through these lenses. So I think that we can meet ourselves and other people with a lot of compassion around our different worldviews and how that's affecting how we're showing up right now. So when I first saw this meme a few weeks ago, you're not working from home, you're at home during a crisis trying to work, I thought, yeah, totally, that's me. And it's not normal what we're trying to do, and we need to account for that fact. And this really represented my reality, both in the fact that I was privileged enough to be able to transition my work to my home, and also that I would still be able to collect a paycheck. But even within that fortunate employed working at home group, we all have our unique challenges. So, a lot of us have steep learning curves around all the new tech, just even creating a space to work in uninterrupted. Some of us are dealing with families and housemates and sharing the internet, just how many people can be socially connecting and working and going to school and streaming Netflix on the average residential internet account. And I'm sure there's going to be many articles written about pandemic parenting while working full time. And we also see this a lot, you know, we're all in this together. We're all 6 feet apart together. But, you know, some of the burden of stress for me, and I think for a lot of us, has been the way that these times have shone such a bright light on the inequities that exist in our communities and in the world. And for many of us that are working with marginalized folks or having our own experience of marginalization, we know all too well the direct line between the social determinants of health and the negative impacts on health outcomes. So, you know, things like loneliness and social isolation, poverty, financial insecurity, and we're all watching this growing impact that it's having on people we love and the people that we serve and all around us. So, you know, some of us are also having to navigate our own fear and uncertainty about the worsening, desperate circumstances that people are facing. You know, for me, working in grief and loss for so long, I have a tendency towards trying to make meaning as a way of coping. And so I found myself during the early weeks of the pandemic looking for meaning and also, you know, trying to find the potential gifts in what was happening. So some of the things that I noticed were, you know, the lessening pollution or increasing health of the planet, watching, you know, spontaneous acts of kindness between neighbors and strangers, and this intentional focus on staying socially connected while we physical distance. And, you know, I even at one point began to feel really hopeful because I thought, wow, people in, you know, previously undervalued positions like grocery store clerks and PSWs and janitorial service workers are finally, you know, getting the recognition and maybe the compensation for their worth. But, you know, as the voices of, you know, needing to restart the economy and get back to normal, get back to business as usual, as those voices have grown louder, I felt kind of discouraged and a little bit panicky, thinking, no, we're not ready to go back. You know, we haven't addressed all these issues. We haven't learned our lessons yet. And so I feel a sense of sadness about that. And I think for those of us that are oriented towards being helpers, our challenge right now is to, you know, hold hope and possibility in the face of despair and uncertainty and sorrow. And that's a tough balance, and it takes a lot of work. So if you haven't figured out by now, this webinar grew out of my own experience of the first few weeks of this pandemic. So there's a quote, Craig, on the next slide. The purpose of life is to discover your gift. The work of life is to develop it. And the meaning of life is to give your gift away. And, you know, I am so passionate about the work I do. Some of you out there may know me. I'm very relationship driven. My work has always been about connection and relationship building and companioning. And so when this all started, I really noticed myself feeling very anxious and uncertain about how this new reality was going to affect my ability to do the work that I love, you know, especially as someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with online learning platforms. And, you know, I find in-person education and training sessions so much richer. I learned from Yvette a long time ago that, you know, doing training with groups is a co-creation. And so this kind of one-way teaching model is very new for me. So I've really struggled with questions of meaning and identity. And as this quote says, you know, the meaning of life is to give your gift away. So how can I be who I really am and bring my gifts to the world when the world as I know it is turned upside down? So it occurred to me that there might be other helpers out there who are feeling the same way. And Viktor Frankl is someone who's written a lot about meaning making, and there's a list of resources at the end of the webinar. So everything I talk about, you don't have to worry about writing down. But Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning, I take comfort from some of his words. He talks about meaning coming from three things. And the first is the work we offer in times of crisis, the love that we give, and our ability to display courage in the face of suffering. So I'm leaning into that wisdom as we move forward. So I've also felt really overwhelmed in moments by the amount of information that is coming at me. I don't know if any of you can relate to this illustration, but this is my pandemic brain. This is how it feels some days. You know, there's just no shortage of emails and posts and offerings, you know, for online learning and articles about, you know, how to become nimble in response to client needs and, you know, how to cope with self-isolation. And I feel such pressure to absorb it all and take it all in. I don't want to miss anything. And at the same time, I'm still trying to acclimate to the reality of COVID-19 and keep up to, you know, speed on all of that. And with all of that, still manage to show up well for myself, for my colleagues, my volunteers, clients. And I want to do that with patience and grace and creativity and compassion. And it's really hard because I feel this sense of urgency to quickly adapt to this new and changing landscape, which, you know, let's face it, has only been in play for what, 2 months, 3 months? So we're still in the very early days of this. So I remind myself to sort of slow down and just give myself a break that, you know, there's no clear map forward for any of us. We're all figuring this out together as we go along. And so when I start to feel frustrated and like I'm spinning my wheels, I try and, you know, be gentle with myself. So I've spent a lot of time in my personal and professional life living with and learning about this thing called grief. Some of you may have seen this illustration before. I think it's so perfect. And, you know, those lenses that I talked about earlier about all of us having, mine include a tendency to sort of look at most things in life through the lens of loss. And so this COVID-19 experience feels very familiar to some of us because it so closely mirrors the grief experience, including that feeling of being parachuted into a new landscape with no map, no compass, no language facility, no capacity, and yet still being asked to figure out a way to keep putting one foot in front of the other when all we really want to do sometimes is just curl up under the covers. So, you know, I think it's really important to remember that grief has no timetable. It's not a linear process. It's more of a spiral. It's a bit chaotic. And that's kind of how this feels right now. It also reminds me of another really important piece of grief theory that feels particularly resonant. And that's the 3 essential questions in loss. So in loss, we're dealing with 3 essential questions that take us across 3 dimensions of time. So who am I? Who have I been? And who am I becoming? And Dr. Samit Kumar, who's a psychologist in a cancer hospital in Florida, he's also an author of the book called Grieving Mindfully. Recently, I was on a webinar with him and he told a story about meeting with a group of nurses in the hospital before their shift on the COVID floor. And they were understandably, you know, tired and scared and overwhelmed and really uncertain about the future. And he posed a question to the group. He said, "What do you want at the end of this?" And one of the nurses replied, "I want to be a whole person." Just breathe that in. I want to be a whole person. And, you know, for me, that essentially means that on the other side of this, whatever that other side looks like, I still want to be able to love myself, love others. I want to come through this experience with my capacity and my heart intact. And, you know, I think some of us know this experience from early days in the AIDS crisis, that sense of, you know, how are we ever going to get through this and what am I going to be on the other side? And I think it would serve all of us well right now at this time to spend some time reflecting on who do I want to be on the other side of this? I think self-awareness and self-reflection is really vital at this time of, constant change. So in order to do this really important work of self-reflection, which not only is a vital part of integrating the reality of COVID-19 and how it's impacting us now and will continue to impact us, but it's also really vital in providing good service. I need to understand and acknowledge my pandemic brain, and I need to find ways and time to clear my browser history or clear the cache, so to speak, and do a reset. So for me, it's become a daily practice. I'm really fortunate. I live close to the lake. This is a picture I took a couple of weeks ago. And I think having access to nature has been so important in terms of counterbalancing that relentless intake of new information and strategies and needs and calls to action and that urgency and that that we're taking in and all the information that we're taking in. So for me, it's about finding like a quiet little corner of nature, the natural world to just sort of drop into, even if it's just for a few moments. And that's really an essential daily practice for me. So, I invite you to think about what is your best way to clear your browser history and make room to move forward. So, I don't have time for self-care. Haven't you heard there's a pandemic out there? That's sort of what I've heard some people say. And, I think as helpers, it goes against our very nature to think about or put our own needs first. And I think especially at this time of crisis in our world, stopping to think about ourselves can feel like a real luxury and a privilege that we just can't afford right now. But I invite you to think about something that, anyone who's ever been on an airplane will be familiar with the flight attendant safety demonstration. And they say, in the unlikely event of a change in cabin pressure, an oxygen mask will fall from the ceiling. And the instructions that we receive from the flight attendants couldn't be clearer. If we want the people that we're traveling with, that we care about, to survive whatever looming disaster may result from the need for oxygen masks falling from the ceiling, we first have to take care of ourselves by putting our own mask on. And that's so counterintuitive. But I think in the current world climate, I really would invite you to think about adopting this as a kind of essential life instruction, because you can't give well from a place of diminished capacity. You just can't. So that's the context. The next part is the reframe. So years ago, I read an article by Rachel Naomi Remen, and it profoundly changed the way I looked at my role in the work. And also it really continues to influence the education and training I do with workers and volunteers. So Dr. Remen calls us to shift our thinking about how we see ourselves in our roles. So shifting from carrying the responsibility and weight of helping or fixing towards serving someone. So she says helping, fixing, and serving represent three different ways of seeing life. And, in this time of COVID-19 and its fallout over the months and years to come, which we're all going to be dealing with, I think that this is a really useful bit of wisdom, kind of a foundational anchor. So again, there's a link to the full article at the end of the presentation, but I want to share some of her words with you. So she says, when you help, you see life as weak. And so she says, when you help, you use your own strength to help someone with less strength. So it's sort of a one up, one down relationship, and people we work with really feel this inequity. When we help, we might inadvertently take away more than we give, diminishing the person's sense of self-worth and self-esteem. So Craig, you can forward the slide. Yeah. So the second part, she says, is when you fix, you see life as broken. So she talks about, which I love, she says, you don't fix people, you fix broken pipes. So, when you help, you see life as weak. When you fix, you see life as broken. And that's such a judgment, right? And that judgment creates a real distance and really separates us from one another. But instead, she invites us to look at it from a different point of view. She says, we serve with our whole selves. The wholeness in us serves the wholeness in the other and the wholeness in life. So in other words, when we serve, we draw from all of our experiences. So our limitations serve, our woundedness serves, even our own darkness and struggles can actually be of service. So we're not serving from a place of expertise, we're serving from a place of experience, which is a real different way of looking at it. She says, fixing and helping is exhausting. And frankly, in my opinion, I think it's at the root of what we call compassion fatigue. Because if we just keep giving and giving and giving, and there's no reciprocity in the exchange of energy, we're going to be depleted. But Dr. Rimmons suggests that service is more mutual. When I help, I have a feeling of satisfaction. But when I serve, I have a feeling of gratitude. And I'll tell you that over the years, gratitude has been a really important part of my coping strategies. She also says, serving requires us to know that our humanity is more powerful than our expertise. I love that line so much. Our humanity is more powerful than our expertise. So who we are and how we show up is more important than what we think we know or what our expertise is. And she said, when we see the wholeness in another, we strengthen it. And then they may be able to see it for themselves for the first time. And so, trusting in our own humanity means being able to overcome that fear of not being enough, right? It means noticing, but not reacting to our urgent desire to fix it or to get it right. And often that results from us wanting to ease our own anxiety. But our mistaken need to be an expert is what takes us to that place, that urgency of wanting to give advice or know how to respond. Another way of looking at it is looking at service is through the framework of companioning. Dr. Alan Wolfelt came up with this concept of companioning. He's the director of the Center for Loss and Transition. So he says companioning is about going into the wilderness of the soul with another human being. It's not about thinking you're responsible for finding the way out, which again, I love, because it shifts that weight of feeling totally responsible away from us as carers. Eugene Balfour, who's a spiritual care coordinator at a hospice in Southern Ontario, also talks about companioning. He says, companioning theory holds that in every shared moment with another, there is simultaneously something being given and something received, which again, that mutuality I think is so powerful. So this is one of my favorite quotes that I use in training. There are two ways of spreading the light, to be the candle or the mirror that reflects it. So if we come from a viewpoint of having to fix or help, it means that we're in charge, right? We need to be the expert. We need to hold the candle or the light for our clients because they aren't able to. And going back to Dr. Rimmons' words, she says, when we help, we may inadvertently take away more than we give, diminishing the person's sense of self-worth and self-esteem. So this Edith Wharton quote reminds me that our most important job might be in that being the mirror that reflects back to people and magnifies their own capacity and resilience. So when we come to service with this as an underlying value, our egos can get out of the way and we can stop worrying about getting it right and instead focus on being present with who and what is right in front of us. So you might be thinking, great, now I see myself as a server and not a helper. So what does that mean? And what do I do? So if I think of myself as a server and I serve for my own humanity, then by extension, I see myself as the tool or instrument of providing service. So I would suggest that the answer to the question, what do I do, is this. The being is the doing. This is something I started saying years ago in volunteer training, because I think that that presence that we bring and how we show up and the quality of our being is actually a very active thing. That is the doing. So being is doing. So what are the keys to being? Well, first of all, exquisite presence. You know, the attention that we can give to another person, the quality of how we show up for another person is so important, especially right now. And how we bring ourselves to someone fully and attentively. Parker Palmer wrote a really amazing article called The Power of Presence, and I would encourage you to read it. There's a link at the end. I also think that focusing on authenticity and something that Margaret Wheatley talks about, which is approaching each encounter with another human being with humble curiosity. I think that that's, you know, really powerful, and it really necessitates us bringing an openness and a patience and a stance of, you know, what am I going to learn in this situation? I know that I'm going to be changed. I'm going to learn by this situation. So rather than what am I bringing, what am I going to receive? What is going to be the quality of the experience of how we meet? Being also really requires us to be mindful. And, you know, mindfulness is simply present moment awareness. So being in this moment. And when we're in this moment, I think that it gives us a capacity to really hear with bigger ears and see with bigger eyes and receive people with bigger hearts. And it also helps us to be aware of the judgments and filters and assumptions that often get in the way of us being able to truly see each other as whole, unique human beings. And being also invites us to become comfortable with silences. So not having to immediately respond to what someone is sharing, and to know the value of our role, which is sacred story catchers. So really being there for someone, being willing and wanting to bear witness to their humanity, their story, their truth, that really is enough. And Peter Levine, who's a leading trauma expert, talks about the fact that trauma isn't what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. Okay, so this is where I'm going to give you the 3 concrete tips that I promised. So first of all, if you haven't already, I really encourage you to begin some kind of mindfulness practice. And if you have a mindfulness practice, maybe look at how you can fine tune it right now to suit your current needs and the situation. So I'll tell you a story about a pivotal experience that really changed my understanding of an ability to practice mindfulness meditation. So I was really fortunate over 20 years ago to attend a workshop with Lou Carcassoli, who's a leading mindfulness practitioner in Toronto. And he delivered this really compelling presentation on the many benefits of meditation and mindfulness. And he showed a clip from a documentary that, you know, researchers had done on the brain and the physiological, you know, positive impact, and, you know, talked about improvements in concentration and stress management. And, you know, I was totally sold. I mean, I was really excited. And at the end of the presentation, he said, you know, are there any questions? And of course, my hand shoots up in the air, good little student that I am. And I said, yes, Lou, you know, this was a great presentation, and I'm totally sold on this whole meditation thing. I just have one question. What's the minimum amount of time one needs to meditate every day in order to feel some of these amazing benefits that you're talking about? And so Lou said, well, you know, how often do you meditate now? And I said, oh, no, I don't meditate at all. To which he responded, well, pretty much anything more than that, and you're going to find some benefit. which really was the perfect thing for him to say, because if he had said, you must rise with the sunrise and sit on a pillow in the lotus position for an hour every day, I never would have done it. But what he said to me was, you know, can you find 5 minutes in your day, sitting on the subway or just before you're going to sleep, to just bring your attention to your breath or bring your attention to the present moment? And, you know, he gave me some suggestions for guided meditations I could listen to. And I started out really slowly and I made it a really simple practice. And I'll tell you something, it's made all the difference. And especially now, one of the first things that I did a few weeks ago when this all started was at work, we have a software called Teams where, you know, we meet virtually like on Zoom. And I created a mindfulness, midday mindfulness team. So every day at noon, you know, whoever wants to join in can join me and we do like 15 minutes of mindfulness, because I knew that there was so much happening and I could easily get overwhelmed and get too far ahead of myself, that practicing mindfulness really helped me to be in the moment. And, you know, I think that this is another piece of wisdom that I've been fortunate to receive over the years, that, you know, if I want to learn how to sit well with other people, and that's to me what service is all about, I need to learn how to sit well with myself first. So mindfulness is a gateway to that. So the second tip is learn what it means to really hold space. So, you know, how we hold space and, you know, learning how to be comfortable with the discomfort and cultivating that capacity to hold space, I think, is something that's really, really important. Holding space for ourselves, but also for other people. So I don't know if we're going to show the quick video. It's only like a minute and a half.
Sorry, Betty Ann, we forgot to embed that separately.
Okay,
So
that's
people can
okay.
click on,
So
when we send out the presentation, they can click on the link themselves and be able to watch it. My apologies.
there's also a really great article on holding space. And I've also included a link to that. So that's tip number 2. And like I said, part of holding space is about getting comfortable being in the presence of pain. So I think our most important role right now is to be able to hold steady and bear witness to the stories that are coming from people and that are going to come from people in the months and years to come as a result of this. So, you know, right now we might be sitting with someone virtually who's really struggling and in crisis, and we may not be able to do anything concrete to change their current circumstances. And that is really, really painful. But here's what I know. Struggle is an important part of any growth experience. And so, you know, it's important to know that being in the presence of someone else's pain is a skill that we can develop, right? So it's really hard. It's really, I mean, I know it's hard to be in the presence of my friends and my loved ones' pain, never mind a client that I'm working with. But I'll offer this to you, that if you've ever watched a butterfly emerging from its cocoon, and I highly recommend, if you haven't been to a butterfly conservatory, this photo I took at the Niagara Falls Butterfly Conservatory, or as I like to call it, the happiest place on earth. If you've ever stood and watched the birth of a butterfly, the emergence from the cocoon, it looks really painful, right? Like, you know, those little butterflies are like fighting to get out of their cocoon. And when I stand back and watch, I think, oh, that looks so painful. And the struggle is real. But I would offer to you that just as butterflies really need to be left to their own devices to work their way out of their cocoon, I learned that that is actually how they grow the muscles in their wings to fly. So if we reached in and tried to help them, we'd actually be doing them a disservice. So just as butterflies need to be left alone, I really believe that the presence, our exquisite presence that we can bring to clients to bear witness without any interference may be also the thing that they need to grow stronger wings that they need for their own transformation. And any of us who've lived through the experience of loss, we know that it's a transformative experience. And we know one of the most powerful things to help us learn to live with this really painful but necessary transformation is to have witnesses. So remember that being is doing. Being, if you're with a client, if you're with a friend and they're struggling and you want to move in to fix it or change it or give them advice, try and bring in the image of the butterfly and just hold space. The third tip that I'll offer you is to find your go-to strategy for staying grounded. I'm right now doing one of them. I'm holding a stone, which I always hold when I'm doing training because it helps to bring me back into the moment. You know, at the beginning, we did the just taking a few deep intentional breaths. Planting your feet firmly on the ground can really help. You know, imagining roots growing out of the bottom of your feet. You know, it all sounds a little bit airy-fairy, but it works, trust me. Having a grounding object, something again that, you know, you might actually want to use a stress ball, which is a little bit more fun because you can squeeze it, but something that you can hang on to. And then another technique is called bracketing, and that happens to be my personal favorite. So I'm going to walk you through what that means. So we all get triggered doing this work, and that's the reality. Doing this work of service, and maybe now more than ever, because we are all dealing with so much constant change and stress and uncertainty while we're supporting others who are also dealing with that. So it's really important, I think, to remember that your thoughts and feelings are valid, right? So bracketing is a simple 3-step process. So when you're with someone and your own story gets triggered or something the person is sharing with you really brings up a feeling or a memory for you, the first step is to acknowledge it, right? To just acknowledge it's there, it's distracting you, it's okay, it doesn't make you a bad person. It's actually a normal part of the process. The second step is to deliberately, as this illustration shows, take a set of brackets and just put it around whatever thought or feeling or experience you're having in that moment. You know, just say, okay, I see you, I acknowledge you, I know you're here, but I need to put you aside because in this moment, I need to stay engaged with the person that I'm serving. And the third step is to return to that later in order to address it. So to go back to whatever it is you put in your brackets and pick it up. And I think if we want to succeed in being fully present with the people we serve, we really do need to find a way to acknowledge what's happening inside of us, put it aside so that we can be effective in the moment. And then the key, I think, to this bracketing technique is if you make a deal with yourself in the moment that you're going to acknowledge something in your own story that might be coming up, you need to go back to it, because if you don't return to deal with whatever's come up, the bracketing technique will stop working. I know this from experience. So you can't cope with something until you first name it. So how you take those brackets off is up to you, and it's going to be as unique an individual as you are. So, you know, some people may choose to do something physical, like go for a walk or a run. Some people might do some self-reflective writing. Some might need to find someone to hold space for them so they can vent. But whatever you do, know one thing, that you know, feelings can be postponed, but they can't be denied. That's another thing that I've learned the hard way. So bracketing is only going to work if you actually tend to those thoughts and feelings. And, you know, this is a really simple mindfulness technique for dealing with feelings. Notice the feeling, name the feeling, sit with the feeling, let the feeling go. Sounds very simple. It's not. It's complicated and it's not easy, and it takes practice. And however you choose to unbracket, you know, find safe spaces to do it. You know, I know there's a lot of stuff online right now. I think the Government of Canada just launched a new website called Wellness Together, where you can access online supports. You know, look to your team. Sometimes it's hard when you're on a team where you're all helpers it's like, who's going to actually be the one to admit their vulnerability first and say, hey, I've got these feelings coming up. But I really encourage you to find ways to do it, because we want to learn how to meet our emotions with some kind of equanimity, so that we can stay grounded and serve the people that we serve. So finally, I'll just say that it's virtually impossible to be a strong space holder unless we have others who will hold space for us. So please find your space holder. And then the last slide I have is a quote that really resonates with me. Once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through, how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure, in fact, whether the storm is really over. But one thing is certain: when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person who walked in. That's what the storm is all about. So this storm that we're living in is transforming us. And I hope that I gave you something today to help you weather the storm. That's all I got.
Thank you, Betty Ann. That was really wonderful awareness building. And as much as I practice some of these things, for me, it was a really great reminder that I need to do it more intentionally during these times. I saw in the chat that there was a question or two, so I'll turn it over to Craig to bring those up.
Hi, Betty Ann. Every time I sit with you, I learn more and more. So I love the chance to pose these questions, because they've been in my head as well. In our situation, volunteers are unable to physically be present and volunteer in person during this time. So the feeling of helplessness goes beyond the global sense of being out of control of our circumstances right now. It is a real and tangible limitation that they are experiencing. So how does that kind of helper server cope with feeling helpful?
Yeah. Well, that's what's happening in my my organization too. I think that, the first thing I think we all have to acknowledge is that we need to find new ways to feel helpful. And I have volunteers that they're used to going out every week into someone's home and sitting with someone and being present with someone. Some of them are doing that on the telephone now, and it's actually not as disconnected as some of us thought it would be. Sometimes it actually, having that that distance through the phone, gives a person a little bit more space to think and feel and process without you being right up in their face. So there's definitely, I think, ways that we can stay connected. If your client isn't able to be on the phone or doesn't want to be on the phone, I have some volunteers that have been writing letters to their clients, which is, really kind of old school and beautiful. And, even writing a little note and dropping it by if you don't, want to trust it going in the mail. But also I want to really encourage you to think about the fact that energetically, we can still be connected to people, even if we're not in the same room with them. So many people are dealing with this with their loved ones who are being hospitalized and they're not able to be there. But there is something, I think, very powerful about intention. And I think that energy follows intention. And I think that in whatever way makes sense to you, to find ways to still will good to your clients, and to believe that that energy will actually impact. And talk to your fellow volunteers and friends about how they're doing it, because there's a lot of creative ideas out there that are happening. So, don't be afraid to talk about it. Like I said, you got to name something before you can cope with it.
So I think that leads into one of our next questions, Betty Ann. What if you're feeling phone calls to clients are adding to your stress?
Yeah. Well, then I would, I'd invite you to think about how are you clearing your cache, right? So it's not any different than when we invite volunteers into in-person service. I always say to people, there's 24 hours in a day, and you need to create space that's going to fit into your day and not displace important things like self-care. So, take a look at what is it about the phone call that's making you anxious. what do you need to do? Do you need to do some self-care practices before or after? And frankly, you know, I've had volunteers who've said to me, and I said this in the first days when we sent out an email to all our volunteers saying, you know, that our in-person services were being suspended, but that people could continue doing phone support. I said, for some of you, that may not even be possible because, again, remember, this pandemic is affecting all of us. So maybe your volunteer is dealing with financial insecurity. Maybe they don't have the privacy to make a phone call at home. You know, if the work isn't serving either one of you, it's probably a good idea to take a look at whether or not that should be happening. I also, though, would think about, I would want to examine more about what is stressing you out, because if the stress is that you feel like you're not being effective, then you need to go back to that belief in yourself that being present is enough.
This presentation was great. It has really helped me to understand why I'm feeling so empty and useless. And to the people that need us the most right now. I'm a hospice volunteer and working now in the Compassionate Communities Initiative. Through hospice, to reconnect isolation and lonely seniors to their community has improved the quality of their lives. Needless to say, this initiative has stopped.
Yeah.
And that sort of links into another comment that came down is how can we connect with our loved ones who are in long-term care homes, especially if we don't have power of attorney?
Yeah, I have several friends who are in that situation, and a lot of our seniors don't have the technology to operate, you know, FaceTime. So one thing I've seen is that people have their loved one either go to the balcony of their room or go to the main floor where there's a window, and they meet outside and talk on the phone, you know, or bring signs or sing or play music. Again, I really think that intention has a lot to do with it. So, you know, finding a way to communicate to your loved one, I really wish I could be there. I can't, but know that I'm out here thinking of you. And maybe you're doing things like listening to their favorite music or watching their favorite TV show, but to let them know that you're really consciously and intentionally carrying them with you every day in your heart, even if you can't physically be with them.
Next comment I have for you, Betty Ann, is thank you so much, Betty Ann, for strengthening my beliefs of allowing my humanity to be involved in everything I do, alone or with others, family, friends, store clerks, strangers I come across. All my love.
Amen.
And the last comment that we have at the moment is excellent, helpful, and informative. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. As I said, there's a lot of resources that are at the end of the presentation, so I really invite you to explore some of them. But let this be a time of bringing as much exquisite presence and compassion to yourself as you do to the people that you serve, because you deserve it. And it's a tough, tough time for all of us.
Well, I want to thank Betty Ann Rutledge for putting this presentation together and agreeing to do it. I don't remember you saying this in your beginning, but this is Betty Ann's very first webinar, and I know she was very nervous about it, and I hope you will all join me in thanking her very much in doing an amazing job. Congratulations, Betty Ann, on your first webinar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, I see there's 2 hands raised. So sorry, we do have another minute if Craig wants to do those. We want to get all the information out that we can.
Okay, I'm just trying to find the question here.
And I see there's something in Q and L. That's okay.
So yeah, thank you so much. Love the thoughtful quotes. You seem like a pro. I'm not seeing where the 2 hands are raised. So I apologize to those individuals. Much like Betty Ann, this is my first attempt at running it in this manner as well.
It's a new world for all of us. If anyone has any questions, My email is beingisdoing@gmail.com. beingisdoing@gmail.com. So if you didn't get a chance to ask your question or you want to follow up on anything, feel free to get in touch with me. And thank you for your service, and just take really good care of yourselves.
So I do see one question from David Plotkin. Can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Maybe he doesn't want to. Maybe he wants to stay anonymous.
David, you have to unmute. You're muted right now. Okay, well, I'm not seeing anything change, so.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there, David, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, but I'm not familiar with this this system. But anyway, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I said I think you mentioned meditating, and I find it. I haven't tried it much, and I find it difficult to meditate.
Mm-hmm.
That's my problem. Everything else that you said resonated with me.
Great.
And I'm doing some of those things.
Awesome. Well, there's some resources around kind of taking some baby steps into meditation. There's a lot of amazing websites out there, even just starting with listening to a guided meditation, finding something that works for you in your routine, but be gentle with yourself. Mindfulness can happen anytime. You can mindfully make dinner, you can mindfully do your dishes, you can mindfully take your dog for a walk. So it doesn't have to be anything formal or fancy.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, David.
Thank you. It was a pleasure listening to you. You did well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Is this going to be the only webinar, or are there going to be more in the future?
We haven't determined that yet.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned and look for information. And again, this website has this webinar has been recorded and will be posted to our website. So if you want to review it again, or if you know of someone that wanted to attend and wasn't able to, they can view the recording that will be on our website under webinars, and it will probably be up by latest Monday. So you can check our website for that at abrpo.org.
And
again,
I think Mahari is also going to be emailing out the slides as well as a link to the webinar.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you'll get that information. So again, thank you everyone for participating. And thank you very much, Betty Ann, for your wonderful presentation.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too. And thank you, Mahari, for doing all the logistical stuff. And thank you, Craig, for advancing the slides and managing the chat questions. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and be well with yourself. Thank you.